The crowd had gathered like never before, filling St. Peter's Square with a sea of people from every corner of the world. From early morning, pilgrims, tourists, and locals alike flocked to the heart of Vatican City. They came with one shared purpose: to witness a moment of history. And it wasn't just those who could make the physical journey. Screens lit up homes, churches, and public spaces from Manila to Madrid, New York to Nairobi. All eyes were fixed on the balcony above the grand columns of the Basilica. It was here that Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, now Pope, would deliver his very first prayer as the newly elected spiritual leader of over 1 billion Catholics. The atmosphere was almost otherworldly. There was a deep stillness, an emotional quiet, that blanketed the square. The sheer volume of people made it nearly impossible to move freely, yet no one was complaining. Everyone stood patient, alert, reverent. They waited not just to hear words but to feel something, to be part of a spiritual awakening unlike any in modern times. And then he appeared. There he stood, gentle but firm, smiling with humility, yet radiating the quiet strength of someone, deeply rooted in purpose. This was Pope Tagle, the first ever Filipino pope, a man of modest origins who had now ascended to the highest spiritual office in the Catholic Church. He wasn't just a symbol for the Philippines, he had become a beacon for the world. As he looked out over the enormous crowd, there was a glimmer of emotion in his eyes. Then he began to speak. His first words were not in Latin, nor Italian, nor English. They were in Filipino. Ama namin, sumasalangit ka. The familiar cadence of the Lord's Prayer, spoken in his native tongue, echoed across the square and across airwaves worldwide. A hush fell. You could feel the unity ripple through the audience. It was a subtle yet deeply meaningful gesture, one that reached beyond borders and wrapped itself around the hearts of millions. The beauty of the moment was not just in the words, but in what they represented: humility, heritage, and universal love. After completing the prayer in Filipino, he gracefully transitioned to Latin, the language of tradition and the Church's historical liturgy. Pater Noster, quies in caelis. And in that moment, history truly felt alive. His voice, calm, compassionate and steady, carried across the centuries. The prayer formed a bridge between ancient tradition and modern life, between East and West, between a deeply rooted institution and a rapidly changing world. His tone was not lofty or distant. It was human, accessible, warm. He prayed for peace, for those affected by war and conflict, for refugees and the displaced. He prayed for unity, not just within the Church, but among nations, among people, among families. He prayed for the poor, the forgotten, the ones who live on the margins of society and often go unseen. His words were clear, soft-spoken, yet full of power, a power that doesn't come from authority but from faith and sincerity. And when he finished, he said simply, Amen. Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was sacred. It was filled with unsaid prayers, with thoughts too heavy for words, with hearts bursting with emotion. It was a silence so full that it seemed to hold the world together in that one quiet moment. Then a wave of emotion passed through the crowd. People cried, hugged, kneeled, and prayed. It was as if Pope Tagle's words had lifted something off their shoulders, given them space to breathe and hope again. The moment wasn't just emotional, it was transformational. The scenes in the Philippines were beyond heartwarming. Fireworks lit up the night sky. Church bells rang across cities, towns, and rural barrios. In Manila, traffic came to a halt not from congestion, but from celebration. People stepped out of their homes, waving flags and singing hymns. Grandparents wept openly, children asked curious questions, and parents beamed with pride. For many, this wasn't just a religious milestone, it was a cultural and national triumph. The Philippines, often overlooked on the global stage, had now become the center of the spiritual world. In homes, families gathered around televisions, watching in awe as Pope Tagle's prayer played on loop across local channels. Social media exploded. Hashtags like Chatyo Pope Tagle, a Filipino Pope, and Prayer for the World trended worldwide. It wasn't just a proud moment for Filipinos. It was a unifying moment for humanity. But the real impact of Pope Tagle's prayer couldn't be captured by news footage or viral hashtags. It was happening in quiet ways, in small corners of the globe. People began to reflect. Some who hadn't prayed in years found themselves whispering words of hope. Others called loved ones they hadn't spoken to in months, in remote villages. And dense cities alike, people were reminded that faith in its purest form is not about dogma, it's about connection. The atmosphere was electric. There was something almost sacred about the stillness that settled over the crowd as the moment neared. You could hear the distant flutter of flags, the soft murmurs of prayer, the quiet sobs of those overwhelmed by emotion. It was a moment wrapped in silence and expectation, the kind of moment that the world would remember for generations. Then the doors of the balcony opened. A wave of emotion swept across the square. People gasped, some wept, others simply stood frozen. Pope Tagle stepped forward, his eyes scanning the crowd below. There was warmth in his face, humility in his expression, and deep faith in every step he took. His presence alone spoke volumes, even before he uttered a single word. This was not just a leader stepping into a new role, this was a spiritual father carrying the prayers, pain, and hope of billions. As he looked out onto the faithful, there was no grand gesture, no rehearsed smile, just a moment of human connection. And then he bowed his head and began to pray. But not in Latin, not at first. Ama namin sumasalangit ka, he said softly, the Lord's Prayer, but in his native Filipino tongue. It was a deeply personal and historic gesture. Those words, so familiar to Filipinos, rang through the ancient square like a gentle song. The crowd responded not with noise, but with quiet reverence. Even those who didn't understand the language understood the message. This pope belonged to the world, and he was bringing everyone into his prayer. Soon he transitioned into Latin, tying the present moment to centuries of Catholic tradition. Pater noster, qui es in caelis, he continued, bridging time and culture. His voice was calm yet commanding, soft yet powerful. Every word he spoke seemed to carry with it the weight of centuries and the hope of the future. People listened, not just with their ears, but with their souls. He prayed for peace. He prayed for the forgotten. He prayed for those divided by war, poverty, and hatred. He lifted up the poor, the abandoned, and the broken. He didn't give a speech. He offered a moment of spiritual embrace. This wasn't politics. It wasn't protocol. It was prayer in its purest form, a sincere plea to God for a more loving, compassionate world. The silence that followed his final Amen was unlike any silence the square had ever known. It wasn't the silence of waiting. It was the silence of deep emotion, of unity, of a shared understanding that something historic, something sacred had just taken place. People closed their eyes, bowed their heads, held hands, or simply looked up to the sky. It was a silence filled with meaning, with unspoken prayers and collective hope. And from that moment, the echo of Pope Tagle's prayer began to ripple outward. News channels around the globe interrupted broadcasts to show the scene. Headlines popped up within minutes. A prayer that touched the world. Social media lit up with hashtags. More Pope Tagle, non-Filipino Pope, non-global prayer. Millions who had felt disconnected from their faith suddenly felt drawn back in. It wasn't just about religion anymore. It was about unity, compassion, and hope. In the Philippines, the celebration was unlike anything the country had ever seen. Fireworks lit up the sky. Church bells rang non-stop. Streets overflowed with people singing, praying, and crying tears of joy. Elders spoke of divine purpose. Children wore paper mitres and paraded with small crucifixes. Schools paused to allow students to witness the historic moment. Whole neighborhoods transformed into spontaneous prayer groups and choirs. Grandparents explained to their grandchildren that they were living through history, that this was the first time someone from their islands had risen to lead the global Catholic Church. That faith, service, and humility had brought Pope Tagle from the shores of Manila to the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica. In every Filipino household, pride mixed with prayer. It wasn't about nationalism. It was about seeing someone who, understood the struggles of the